the administration has mischaracterized us yet again in a long history of slandering the BDS movement as supporting violence, supporting genocide, and supporting terrorism. So before we get anywhere into the details, I just want to unequivocally state, and you can go and verify this through any of the documents that have ever been published by the BDS movement, that it is non-violent, that it does not endorse any form of violent resistance up to and including acts of terror, and that it does not take a stance on particular trigger point questions such as the 1 versus 2 state solution. I'll get into that why in just a second, but it's very important that we understand, and can everyone in the very back hear me all good? So, all right, perfect. It's very important we understand that BDS is not synonymous with the entire Palestinian movement for Free Palestine, that it is a constrained movement in the sense that it doesn't take positions on numerous issues, and that it's very, very important that we, when we're talking about BDS, do not conflate our own positions on Palestine and what BDS says, right? You may have a particular position on armed resistance. You may have a particular position on the 1 or 2 state solution. That's all good and well. We should have those discussions. But when you are speaking on behalf of BDS, it is critical that we're not going into those conversations. If people ask us about that, it is critical that we simply reiterate what BDS is for. This is not the time to get into debates about any of these things. This is precisely when people will try to draw us into debates. And I think it's very clear we just be honest. Does anyone in this circle feel like very well versed on the full history of the geopolitics of the region? Neither do I, and I'm probably one of the more well-educated on this topic here. None of us are qualified. Let's just and that's not a embarrassing thing. It's like the media likes to say, it's a complicated issue. It's not a complicated ethical issue, but it is a very sophisticated geopolitical issue, right? So it's not at all giving up. It's not a cop-out to say, hey, look, I'm here as a matter of human rights. I'm here as a matter of standing against apartheid. And that's exactly what the BDS movement is about. Now, the BDS movement was started in the summer of 2005. Just a few months after the second uprising, the second intifada had its negotiated ending. There were 2 major intifadas or uprisings leading into the foundation of the BDS movement in 2005. One from 1987 to 1993, and another from 2000 to 2005. If you look at the first intifada was started after 20 years of ongoing military violence against the people of Palestine and ongoing settler invasion on the Palestinian Arab territories. The trigger point was an accident that was caused by an Israeli vehicle that killed 4 Palestinians. That was the trigger point for what was a non-violent, unless we're going to continue the occasional rock being thrown at armored tractors. Unless you consider that violence, as they are literally ripping down homes, it was a non-violent resistance. The culmination of that were the Oslo Accords, in which Yasser Arafat and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, sold out. I'm not even going to debate this issue. Sold out the Palestinian resistance. Edward Said called this immediately thereafter, an essay called The Morning After. I highly recommend checking that out. But the point is, between the end of the first intifada in 1993 and the beginning of the second in 2000, the number of settlers on designated Arab-Palestinian territory doubled from 200,000 to 400,000. That's settlers, the people. And that was expressed through hundreds of new settlements that kind of popped up into existence. We have to remember that these settlements are not just going to empty space and setting up a camp. These are all predicated on violently, ethnically cleansing these areas first and then settling them, right? As a direct result of the way the PLO capitulated to the United States and to the Israeli occupation, the Oslo Accords ended up actually constraining Palestinian liberation and enabling the occupation to expand its power. In 2000, after even more escalations, there was finally another trigger point, another nonviolent uprising, and at this point, the Israeli military deliberately targeted civilians in a way that was a huge escalation even from the first Intifada. So much so that you even had the United States, which we know whose side they take, was trying to get Israel to de-escalate from the conflict. Instead, Israel successfully militarized the Intifada and managed to transform the issue from a political one about the nature of sovereignty into a security issue, into the question of how is the Israeli state going to protect Jewish Israeli citizens from the terrorists, which became more and more synonymous with all Palestinians. It was out of this context of two major mass nonviolent movements, one of which was forcibly made into an armed resistance by just unrepentant human rights war crimes by the occupation, that Palestinian civil society launched in the summer of 2005 the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement. It did so because it was clear that the Palestinian people were not going to be allowed by the most powerful nations on the planet, led by the United States, to actually participate in the system of international law that they were supposed to be able to, according to the United Nations. Their attempts to engage in non-violent mass resistance had been met by war crime after war crime until the people had no choice but to pick up arms to defend themselves. But they could not, at that time especially, win that game of armed resistance. After ending the Second Intifada, it was therefore decided that the only way to push forward was to call upon the global community to begin to put pressure on the Israeli occupation, following a long history of boycotts. Now, the boycott that often gets pointed to as like the kind of prototype is, of course, the boycott campaign against South Africa, which successfully brought the apartheid regime to its knees and forced it to begin the process of dismantling, though anyone that follows modern issues in South Africa knows that that was not a complete process and still has ongoing. It was still a significant political step forward for the indigenous population of South Africa. However, boycott movements began all the way back in 1880 when the Irish Land League called on a boycott of products produced by English landlords who were doing the exact same thing we're seeing now: settler colonialism, pushing Irish people off the land and subjugating it for English agricultural interests. Another major boycott movement that came out was the Indian Salt March of 1930. And another was the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 to 56. One thing you'll see connecting these is that these aren't just like anti-capitalist, these are all anti-colonial. In Ireland, in India, the black population of the diaspora in the United States, and South African apartheid. Now, there are plenty of cases of labor and otherwise, but there are particular reasons why anti-colonial struggles have had to resort to boycotts and BDS-style movements time and again. It's because the way that global capitalism works is divide up who gets to have access to human rights in the first place. All of these populations were fundamentally denied being recognized as human by the regimes that they were up against. So they weren't able to partake in, however contradictory and artificial our liberal human rights are. Even those were denied to the Irish, to Indians in India, to the black people in the South, and of course to the indigenous population of South Africa. This was denied, and yet due to the overwhelmingly amount of superior firepower that capitalism has managed to arm itself with, that was also not an effective option in most cases, though that's a whole separate conversation. The main point being that in order to advance the discussion of human rights, even on a liberal forum, required putting pressure on these regimes in terms of economics. Now, what we're seeing with the letter that was just sent out by the administration is a very similar turning point from when I was involved in BDS back between 2016 and 2018. This was how it began, with small little insinuations. The admin is too cowardly to even say the word of the organization that they are conflating us with, because they know they're lying. And they were too cowardly to do so at the very beginning last time too. But as more momentum was gained, more and more outrageous lies and claims were circulated ever louder by the mass media. Critically, at the same time, the Zionist website, Canary Mission, was doxing BDS activists. Comrades of mine were doxed in Portland. You can all see my race and presentation of gender. Not a single person that was doxed was white. Not a single person that was doxed was masked. These scum will always target the most vulnerable people in any BDS movement. That's how they divide and conquer, is to single out those who have the most to lose and also generally are the most invested in the conflict. And frankly, unfortunately, the Zionist reaction between 2016 and 2018 was largely successful in putting the pin in BDS until, frankly, the last 9 months. There were various levels of this, including the weird maneuvers here on campus, which we could talk about if anyone's interested in Q&A stuff. So I think the main thing to really take away from this is to remember that we're here, we're taking risks for BDS, and there's a differential in risks, and we're having a lot of conversations about what that looks like. But when we're speaking on BDS, we are going to be speaking for BDS. We can't opt out of that. The moment we speak that, we are representing it. And we have to remember that that means we are representing an essentially Palestinian struggle. We have to take responsibility for that. If we misrepresent it, even unintentionally, we're misrepresenting not this camp, we're misrepresenting the global movement that has done more to advance the Palestinian struggle. Like, so much of the ideological work that was built on in the last 7 months to mobilize was done by the BDS movement. There were so many people who were ready to answer people's questions. There were so many structures that were in place, including organizations like Super and SJP, which directly come out of the BDS movement, that were ready, however beat up they were by the last wave of repression, to get going. And so whatever happens, this struggle needs to be defended in and of itself. And we don't know the next steps. If and when we win liberation in Palestine, this could be the next step in something like the Congo, the Sudan, Haiti. We don't know. And so we need to keep this strategy and this movement as much as the particularity of the Palestinian cause in mind when we're talking about this. So when people ask, what is BDS? There are only 3 things. There are no more than 3 things. There are only 3 things. And in order to be very clear, I'm going to go ahead and just literally read them off directly from the site. If I can just find on my... Okay. So first off, and I don't normally do this kind of teacher shit, but I'm going to do this right now. Please take your phone, type in bdsmovement.net/FAQ. S maybe? FAQS? I can't remember which one.
Yes, S.
With an S. bdsmovement.net/FAQS. And bookmark it. Everything you need is right there, ready to go. I love you all, and I've heard some brilliant politics. Please do not riff on BDFs. This is not the time for creative writing or political interpretation. There's lots of other things we can weigh in on. Please be as verbatim and literal as possible when answering these questions, because I've seen people who really know this shit better than I do have their words twisted in this stuff. There is very little that Zionist reactionaries have invested in more than smearing BDS, and we need to be very careful. So those 3 things are: 1, ending the Israeli occupation and colonization of all Arab lands and dismantling the wall, right? And I'm not going to go into the details of this right now, but just go ahead. When we say this, at the moment, this is the 1967 boundaries. There's a lot of debate there, but that's just what it is at the moment. 2, recognizing the fundamental rights of the Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. And 3, respecting, protecting, and promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties as stipulated in UN Resolution 194, the right to return. And to quote that just real quick, and that'll be the end of all this quoting, The United Nations General Assembly adopts Resolution 1994, Section 3, or 194, Section 3, resolving that, quote, refugees wishing to return to their homes and live at peace with their neighbors should be permitted to do so at the earliest practicable date, and that compensation should be paid for the property of those choosing not to return, and for loss of or damage to property which, under principles of international law or equity, should be made good by the government or authorities responsible. So no military occupation in lands designated as Arab Palestinian, equal rights for all Arab Palestinians living directly under the Israeli government, and the right to return or compensation for those who choose not to, who have been expelled at various stages from al-Nakba forward by ethnic cleansing by the Israeli regime. This is not a call for a one-state solution. This is not a call for the return to the pre-1948 borders. You can probably imagine my feelings on that, and you can probably imagine a lot of people's feelings on that. And I can guarantee you, Omar Barghouti and various others who formed this had a lot of feelings on that. This is a strategy to enable the Palestinian people to get as much breathing room to literally survive. What we're seeing right now was seen by Palestinians for the last decades is coming. It was seen by Edward Said after the Oslo Accords, and it was seen by many people after the militarization of the Second Intifada. This has always been an attempt to build a minimal level of basic human dignity, basic survivability, and basic respect for Palestinian lives and sovereignty in the little bits of Arab Palestinian land that are still designated as such, which is Gaza, which is the West Bank, which is the Golan Heights in Syria, and parts of, or at the time, parts of occupied Lebanon, though that's changed. I'm gonna go ahead, because I know I've covered a lot, and just open to questions here. We could definitely dive a lot more in, but I also do want to emphasize that to a certain extent, obviously, please, and that's a great website for news and everything beyond the FAQS page. I just highly recommend getting familiar with it. Please educate yourself on this, but also if you walk away with nothing else, those three things and an understanding of what BDS does not say is really the most important right now. Because if we can be ready to fire off those three things, if we can be ready and say this is not about armed resistance, this is not about a one-state solution, this is about basic human rights. If we can talk about South Africa and a few other of those historical things, I mean, we've got the Montgomery bus boycotts as part of US history that I'm pretty sure most of us learned in high school is a good thing. I don't remember my teacher being like, oh wow, this was a racist thing against white people. There's no difference between that and what's going on now. So we can have a minimal, sometimes in things like this, less is more, because we will get thrown so many things. If we can just keep on the talking points, we can really defend this. But as a longtime researcher and geopolitical nerd, I am happy to further go down these roads with anyone that's interested. I would love that. It'd be an honor to help develop that. I just think for this teaching, the point is to focus on the basics and to focus on the thing that we're all going to be on the same page on. We need to be on the same page as this. Whatever other differences we have on camp, we don't debate what BDS means. That is not for anyone else but the Palestinian people. And by the way, this is overwhelmingly the largest supported movement of anything in the last, honestly, since 67, I'm pretty sure. Certainly since 87. I mean, it's one of the largest mass movements in Palestinian history, which is famous for its mass movements of resistance. So we should understand that this is not like one thing amongst others. This is not like, oh, you choose your tactics here, we choose our tactics here. This is a global strategy that is being embraced out of desperate necessity by people under occupation and now live action genocide. We need to be very clear on this. And we need to not only protect the cause, but comrades, we need to protect each other. I'll just end on that. Watching my comrades get doxxed, seeing the effects of that, and these were we had an organization to have each other's back. many people here don't have that. Many people here are still just getting involved in the struggle, and they know that, and they will try to exploit that. So please, protect this movement, protect each other, and just be careful in what you say. Not trying to be all negative, but I think given the letter that just came out from admin, we have to take seriously that they will say anything to slander us as long as it protects their bottom line and the interest of American geopolitics, which is what this is all about. So with that being said, I will turn it over for any questions. And if folks want me to develop certain lines more and go back to talking more on certain things, I'm also happy to do that. But I want to pass it over to the ground first. And I'll also keep stacked.
Can you talk about like the targeted nature of the BDS movement?
Sure.
Because I think a lot of people that I've talked to that have like resistance to it say like, oh, so you just want to like boycott Israeli people, and like, so can you talk about like the strategy behind the targeted boycott?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great question. Very good. That's very important to highlight. Yes. The caveat, though, is you can't boycott a nation state effectively without it affecting people. You can't not note that. Depending on the conversation, you can mention something about the 80% polls of folks in Israel that are supporting genocide, but that's if we really get into the weeds. I don't think anyone should focus on that unless you're really backed into a corner. I think what really needs to be focused on is a nation state by international law is beholden to its like people who are its citizens. And regardless of what we have to say about it, the Israeli state positions itself as a democracy. So BDS focuses on the state. It is the state that is enacting these policies. It is the state that is actually like the embodiment of those policies, right? The wall is owned by the state. The military forces are the state. A lot of people will say, well, okay, but you can't do this without affecting folks. You can't do this without like it's not like there's just the government and the population. And that is true. That's the case. But I think the real only argument to that is that's always been the case for any boycott. Someone will always be affected. And frankly, if you look at like, for example, the Irish boycott, it wasn't just like the rich in England that were affected. There were workers in London that were also going to eat that food, right? Like they were importing food from Ireland to keep their own hostage proletariat fed just enough to keep the factories going, right? We can't we're not responsible for the negative externalities of a boycott. If after, I mean, the overwhelming majority of human rights NGOs and whatnot have endorsed BDS. The overwhelming majority of organizations that study genocide have said that this is ethnic cleansing and genocide. If after all that, the occupation continues to double down on militarization, apartheid, and refusing to allow people to return to their homes, they are responsible for the consequences on their people. As a state, they are responsible for the well-being of their people and the effects of their actions as a state. So I think we have to be sure that no, this is not a target of the Israeli people. And if the Israeli people are negatively affected, and we know they will be, that is the moral, under international law, obligation of the Israeli state to take seriously. I know you're an international law person, so I don't know if there are other things you want to add. I would definitely want to hear input if there are other.
I mean, no, I think you about covered it.
Okay.
Yeah, and I was also saying like, in terms of the companies that are boycotted, like they are all kind of there for a specific reason, and it's because they directly or indirectly contribute to occupation, militarization. So it's not just random.
Exactly, yeah. It's either companies that are directly tied into the Israeli economy and therefore are keeping it going. And we should bear in mind that that economy not only relies heavily on US subsidies, but also relies heavily on taxing Palestinians at an incredibly high rate and then not publishing how much revenue they're generating. But yes, we're talking about like Sabra, for example, we'll talk about cultural appropriation. Sabra is cultural appropriation, straight up. It's indigenous cultural products, indigenous food being sold by settlers. Something America does all the time. So maybe we're very used to it over here, but that doesn't change the fact that it is directly involved in expropriating the cultural objects of a colonized people and then turning them into commodities and selling them. HP manages the giant cloud facilities that keep track of Palestinians in a huge, I mean, they make the NSA look chill by comparison. Caterpillar, which we're not directly, but it's often cited, is building like not just tractors, like these are armored tractors that you cannot stop with weapons like machine guns and rockets. Like these are not, old Uncle Bob's tractor at the farm, right? Like these are military vehicles with bulldozers in front, not tractors. And so on and so forth. Like Abby said, that we have, that these companies are either directly driving the economy, that is feeding off of Palestinian people, or in the case of American companies like HP, they're directly, or Dell, they're directly invested in the actual maintenance of the occupation. And therefore are like, under international law, morally culpable in ethnic cleansing and genocide.